Hello everyone, welcome to this video. I am doing a casting call of sorts, I guess you can call it that. Basically, I am looking for artists to help me create a project that I am starting. It is called The Adventures of Wonder Girl. This is a story that I've been working on for a long time. I have a page on castingcall.club for it, and I'm going to be posting it to some other places as well, such as the Voice Acting Club server on Discord, and of course this video on YouTube. Let me go to the project page, and I've already written all the information needed for you to know on there, so I'm just going to go off of that. I am planning on creating an original comic book called The Adventures of Wonder Girl, or TAUG for short, that is inspired by Dragon Ball Z, Ruby, and Scott Pilgrim by getting help from volunteers. But first, I need to create a pilot chapter to create hype. This is something that I've been working on inside my mind since I was a kid, but only recently did I decide to take steps to actually make it happen. The story outline is mostly done and it's fairly long, but in short, it's about a bubbly, good-natured, but also not very bright and naive girl named Jasmine. She uses her powers to help others, like her favorite hero, Atom Man. She then meets others like herself and learns that she is a star being, someone who was created from a star. The level of power of the star being depends on how hot the star from which they are created burns. Epic fights and hilarious hijinks ensue. Meant to be lighthearted like a kid's cartoon most of the time, but can get very dramatic and even very violent during fight scenes. Planning on having some dismemberment and gore for certain scenes, so be prepared for that if you end up working on the project long term. The pilots will be an estimated 110 panels. If you do 6 panels per page, that's about 18 pages. I'll set a deadline of 1 page per week, but we'll be flexible as long as you communicate. I might have multiple artists working on the pilot to speed up the process. I don't really have a budget to pay an artist for the pilot, so I'm testing the waters by asking for volunteers. If you illustrate the pilot, and the project garners a team willing to work on it in the long term, you will be likely contacted to help illustrate the other chapters alongside other artists after the writing phase is done. If the project gets to that stage, it will become a deferred project in which revenue will be split among the collaborators, the terms of which will need to be discussed if and when that revenue comes. Knowledge of martial arts will become important in later chapters. I want this to be very martial arts accurate. There are a lot of animes that kind of already do this. Attack on Titan comes to mind. There's I believe a Korean anime named Lookism that I watched the first 1 or 2 seasons of that had some pretty good martial arts details in there. That's the kind of attention to detail that I'm looking for in this project. But right now for the pilot, it doesn't matter that much because there's not going to be a whole lot of martial arts involved, but something to keep in mind for the future. Here are the instructions. I will provide a link with the script of the pilot chapter. Each black bullet, and I'll bring up the document in a second, is supposed to be 1 panel unless specified otherwise, but I didn't number the panels or divide them into pages because I want the artist to decide the best way to lay out the panels. So if you want to separate a bullet into multiple panels or join multiple bullets into one, you can do that. You will need to draw and color at least 1 page from the script that best showcases your ability to nail the art style and vibe I'm going for. If you do 2 pages, do one of a non-fight scene that showcases the personality/humor of the comic, and the other of the fight scene during the bank robbery. If you do more, in addition to the 1 non-fight scene and the 1 bank fight scene, provide any other pages you believe showcase your abilities the best. Include the date that you started working on the audition. The amount of pages you produce and the time it took to produce them will be taken into consideration, but don't prioritize quantity over quality. The speed at which you work will probably only determine tiebreakers. So if, for some reason I have to pick between 2 artists, if they both produce the same quality of work, but one of them just works faster, then that's going to be the tiebreaker. I will be judging ability to capture characters' personalities, ability to capture intended art style, action choreography, and storytelling through panel composition. I will also provide character reference images that show what each of the important characters look like, as well as the style I'm going for. The cover image on the project is an old drawing that doesn't represent the intended style anymore. So this picture here is a picture that I drew a long time ago, and I'm using this as the cover because I feel like out of all the drawings that I have of this project, this is the only one of the main character that looks the best because it has a background and everything. But this is the art style that I've developed kind of over time naturally, and not necessarily what I want to use for this project. And I'll bring up the images later that more closely approximate what I'm going for. The character images I created approximate the style I'm envisioning, but you may be able to execute it better than I can, so don't feel constrained to making it look exactly the way I drew it. Thick lines like American animation, but with a rough texture like 90s Dragon Ball Z and Scott Pilgrim comics. Anime proportions like Dragon Ball, but simple shapes like Cartoon Network animation. 90s Dragon Ball color palette, maybe even with film grain effect, most of the time. Minimalism for dramatic effect during certain moments like Ruby. Or, I feel like this kind of depends on the moment. I feel like maybe we could incorporate both, but it kind of just depends. Or flashy colors/effects like the Scott Pilgrim movie and animated series. Here's the link to the Google Drive folder that has all the materials that you will need to look at. Oh, they redacted my email. Okay. Well, shit. If you want to email me your audition instead of doing it on castingcall.club, send it to angrymexican563@gmail.com with the subject line Taug Pilot Audition. If you have any questions, you can message me on here or email me with the subject line question about Taug Pilot Audition. How this project will proceed will depend on the types of auditions I get. And then just some important legal information, disclaimer, or whatever you want to call it. I will always retain the rights to Taug, e.g. universe, story, characters, locations, and names. By contributing to Taug, you are granting an exclusive perpetual license until otherwise negotiated to me to use your work for Taug, media, and merchandise. You will retain the right to use your contributions in your portfolio. So what that means is you will still own the copyright, but you're giving me permission to use everything that you create for Taug and exclusively for Taug, which means those things cannot be used for other things. So you can't use it for other IPs, and you won't be able to distribute it. Only myself or any official pages that end up being created for this project will be able to use or distribute the content. Now, if you want to, in the future, change that, like you want to use a character or, I don't know, something that you created for Taug for something else, then perhaps that can be negotiated in the future. Taug has given me a lot of ideas regarding spin-offs that are related to Taug, like a whole story dedicated to the backstory of certain characters that will serve as prequels to Taug, sequels to Taug, both a direct continuation of the stories of the main characters as well as side characters that appeared briefly doing their own thing afterwards. So if stuff like that gets created, then, this is going to have to be discussed. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the link. It's a Google Drive folder that I set to anyone with the link can look at. So in this folder is a Word document that is the script for the pilot chapter, some reference images for the characters, and a subfolder, I'll get into that later, of inspiration images. But if I click on the script, you'll see that it has black bullets. Each of these black bullets is supposed to be a panel by itself, and the white bullets go with the black panels, but they're for dialogue, SFX, and captions. However, that being said, this is a suggestion, maybe a strong suggestion of how to draw the panels, but I'm going to leave it up to the artist or artists to lay out the panels in a way that they think is the best. So if you want to separate these bullets into multiple panels or combine multiple bullets into one panel, then you can do that. So with this picture, it's supposed to communicate the style that I'm going for, which has very thick lines that also have a rough texture to them. The shapes are simplified. So like this is not super anatomically accurate, it's simplified, and I'll kind of show the examples of the inspirations that I drew from. But I kind of simplified this the way that American cartoons do, but not so much to the fact where it's like kind of like in Dexter's Lab, where Dexter's just like a rectangle. You know, like I could have been more like detailed with the side profile, but I just decided to make this a straight line. Things like that. I don't think I really nailed the color palette that I was going for, which is more of like a Dragon Ball Z style, which kind of has like desaturated colors. You know, it's not super like bold the way that Dragon Ball Super is. So you should use this as like the general color scheme, but not like the colors don't have to be exact. I kind of suck at shading, and to try to make gradual shades, I overlaid the colors with subtle gradients. The best way to do shading will be something that will have to be discussed once we get to it. But I definitely think it should be cell shaded. And at most, we should do 3 bands of shading to kind of keep things simple. Something else is the lines vary in thickness according to when I drew it my pen pressure. This is a effect that I want to utilize. So like here where the knees go in, it's a thinner line, and then when the curve flares out, it gets thicker and then it gets thinner again. That's an effect that I want to take advantage of. And then similar to Scott Pilgrim, there are certain parts for shading that are completely inked in with black. I want to incorporate that maybe even to a greater degree than I showed here, and I'll show an example of what I mean in a second. But this is Jasmine, the main character, and each of these files are named with the names of the characters. This is Dr. Evil. He is going to appear, and to be honest, probably not appear again later in the story. He's kind of a very minor character. In fact, he's a fictional character within this fictional universe. This is Atom Man. I'll show where I got the inspiration from in a second, but I was more detailed with the anatomy because the fact that he's super buff needs to come across. Maybe the anatomy can be simplified a bit, but it should still come across. So like this side profile, for example, is more detailed than the previous ones that I showed. Atom Man is going to become an extremely important character throughout the story, so he's kind of important. This is Steven. He's a secondary character who is going to remain throughout the whole story. He's going to have some importance, but not as much as someone like Jasmine and some of the other characters that are going to appear later. Pretty simple. He's an average guy. So, he doesn't have muscles, or like his proportions are all basically rectangles. I kept the glasses simple by just making them rectangles. I made the frames just a solid black line. The side profile is just a rectangle. This is the logo here, but zoomed in. There's going to be a panel where this is going to need to be zoomed in. So inside the subfolder for inspiration images, I have some examples of what I am looking for. In the name of the file is the description of what it is that I'm looking for in this specific image. So this is kind of the color palette that I'm looking for. The highlights in the hair is almost white rather than yellow. And then the shading is more of a yellow color. The color of the skin is also pretty desaturated / pale looking, but on the shading, it gets way more like saturated and darker. There's a little bit more red here. Like this is more of a pink and this is more of a red. Shading on the suit turns from a navy blue to like almost black. During battle scenes, there should be a little bit more detail, like, all these battle damage lines, little bits of blood. But in general, this does have very rough looking lines, and it does vary in thickness a little bit. So you can see there's a little bit of like scratchiness in there. This line is thicker than the rest. I also want to, if possible, recreate this film grain effect that is over this image. This is actually not a frame from the show. This is actually a fan artwork, and you can see his tag up there. So it is possible to recreate this look, but I would have to kind of see how the whole thing looks within the pages of a comic book. So this is the image that I used as a reference for Atom Man in terms of like the shapes of the body. American cartoons tend to draw buff characters with a really big upper body and a small lower body. I want it to be more proportional, but the way that this was drawn, like, the basic shapes, like this is not like super anatomically detailed, like something like Berserk or to some degree Dragon Ball, but it's detailed enough to where it communicates the buffness of the character. It also uses a lot of jagged lines and edges. Like this is not a circle, it's like a hexagon or whatever. This is like a diamond shape. This is a diamond shape or maybe like a triangle shape. And it's kind of the cartoony vibe that I'm going for with this. This also has a lot of really thick lines that serve as shading. That shading is done a lot more than what is done in Scott Pilgrim, which, speaking of, here is a reference image for that. Scott Pilgrim has a very simplistic, cartoony art style that gives it its charm and personality, which I kind of want to emulate, but I don't want the characters to be as stubby looking and like their heads like this really round, like kind of oval square shape. It should be more anatomically correct than this, but not as anatomically correct as some anime. As you can see, there is some variation in the thickness of the lines. There's a little bit of scratchiness in the lines, which I want to emulate. Certain portions are ink thin, like beneath the chin on the neck and underneath some parts of the clothes, like here and here. The effects are not super detailed. It's got some action lines that are not even necessarily that straight in some parts. It has some effects with the colors, like this is a little bit different color than in the center here. But none of this is super complicated, and I would rather keep it simple like this when it comes to effects and stuff to decrease the workload on the artists involved. So if we look at some images from Dragon Ball Z art, stuff like this and this and this look fucking sick, but I think would be way too complicated for the art style that I'm trying to do and would increase the workload of artists involved. Although that also depends on the number of artists that we get and how I divide the workload. So I might have one artist do paneling only and one artist do inking only and one artist do coloring only and another artist do effects like this only. So it kind of depends, but for now I want to stay away from this and go for more of this, which is very simple but still works and looks good. You know, there's a gradient here where this gets more intense and then it slowly gets less intense as it goes on, which is kind of what I did in this image here, but not quite as well. And there is a little bit of a yellow overlay inside the aura that gives the character a little bit of a yellow tint that I think would be nice to implement. But this and this and this is what I'm going for when it comes to effects for now. So here's the example of shading that I was talking about earlier. In Marvel Comics and DC Comics, they use these big sections of black to communicate the musculature of the characters, but this is too detailed for what I'm trying to do. So like, you know, all these individual white lines and all these little black lines, like that's too much. If we can do something like this, but more simplified to where it's more like this, but maybe just, I don't know, slightly more detailed, that would be nice. Here's a good reference image for simplification of body parts for a female character or for a character who's not super buff. So instead of being very anatomically correct with like the shape of the leg, this is just a straight line and this is a curve right here, and then this is a curve and this is a straight line, and that's it. And like there's no separation between the thighs and the hips just go into the waist. Like a lot of things are being kind of merged and simplified. The torso is just a diamond shape. The head here is a circle, which it also depends on the characters. Some characters are going to have some different shapes, and in these style of cartoons, they do that a lot to distinguish the characters from each other. But for the most part, I don't imagine that we're going to be using a perfect circle shape for the head of a character. In a lot of these types of cartoons, they also, when the hands are together like this, it gets simplified where the thumb is separate, but then this is drawn as one shape, and they just draw lines in between that shape to separate the fingers, and the only time when they actually draw the fingers is when the fingers actually separate. That's kind of what I did with these images, just the thumb, and then this is all one shape, and then just the fingers are separated by little lines. Creating ways to simplify the drawing like that are the kind of things that I'm going for. And then this is a good reference image for the use of more intense, jagged, scratchy looking lines that stick out of the objects and characters. during intense moments. So for certain panels, like if a punch is being thrown or someone is getting punched, I think the comic is going to have already a rough line quality, and then taking that further for the action moments by doing something like this is going to be pretty good to implement, I think. And then inside this folder, I have another subfolder called Dramatic Use of Colors, both on characters and backgrounds, no lines, and particles during dramatic moments. There wasn't one image that really captured everything, so I have multiple images here. All these particle effects create kind of a dramatic vibe. Ruby in particular always has these particle effects with rose petals that are specific to her character, and I think finding ways to implement things like that for each character would be nice. This is what I mean by minimalism. There's no lines, so there's no black line separating the folds in the cape. There's no black line separating each parts of the outfit. Is what's separating each thing is the changing color. And there's also a very small amount of color, so it's just red, dark red, gray, black, blue, and white. And again, with the floating particles, this is another way to use colors in a dramatic way, but they've kind of gone in a different direction where they've desaturated all the colors except for certain ones to make those colors pop. This is kind of minimalist use of colors where the background is all one solid color. There's particles. This almost becomes silhouette art. This is another frame of the same moment. The colors have gone from representing what the sky and trees look like to becoming more simplified and artistic. So this is just white. This is just red. This is just red and black. This is just red and black. This is inside a club where the colors were changing throughout the whole thing. There's, dramatic red, this very dramatic white with the tree in the background, very dramatic looking use of black and white. And I've gone ahead and added this image as well, which is actual silhouette art that kind of follow the same principles as the other ones, but is, because it's a silhouette, is even more simplified than this sort of minimalism presented here. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm going for. That's all the information you need to know. I might update this. I'm not super sure how auditions work on castingcall.club when it comes to non-audio submissions. I guess artists will have to provide some kind of link or some way to, add their submissions to this. But I'll cross that bridge once I get there when I make this public. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing everybody's submissions, and I hope that the project gets some support. I'm excited to see where the future of this project leads.